Hello, Cybersphere, and welcome to Shandor's House in London. This is the Good Governance Institute and CAPSTIC's first live streaming event in this format. It's part of an important project of work that CAPSTICS and the Good Governance Institute are doing with NHS England. The title of the work is Helping CCGs to Develop Governance Arrangements that are as effective as possible. And it's a project with two key deliverables we'll be talking about over the next hour. And one is to identify the use of the proposed language to describe governance that's engaging to clinicians and the public. And secondly, to develop a proposed set of outcomes for good governance that can be described and measured. I'm Andrew Corbett-Nolan, the Chief Executive of the Good Governance Institute. And tonight, I'm joined by a panel who are going to discuss this issue. I'd like to quickly introduce them. There's Cameron Watkinson, who's Head of Governance at NHS Hardwick Clinical Commissioning Group. There's Gerard Hanratty, who's a partner at CAPSTICS. We have Alex Morton, who's Director of Commissioning Strategies and Relationships at NHS England, and David Jenkins, who's lay member and Deputy Chair of NHS Dorset CCG. Before we start the panel discussion though, I'd like to introduce you to Nicola King. Nicola is the Head of Commissioning Skills at NHS England, and she's going to spend a few minutes explaining why NHS England commissioned this project from us.
Well, good evening everyone, and it's great to be here, and it's rather strange talking to an audience when we don't know who they are and where they are, but it's exciting too. I've spent the last 12 months or so on behalf of the Commissioning Directorate in NHS England, working with CCGs to help them with things that they've wanted help with. And one of the things that we heard a lot from CCGs in the early stages was that they were struggling with some aspects of their governance arrangements. And this was, when we talked to them and listened to what was being said, there were two key elements to that. One was a sense of recognising that there was a kind of formula that people who are involved in governance will recognise, that is often used in organisations, that is used in lots of NHS organisations, and we kind of know what that formula is. So, you know, you have a board and you have non-executives and you have executives, and the non-executives hold the executives to account and are in the majority, and there's usually a chair, and they would normally be a non-executive, and then you have a set of committees and so on. And what people were saying that they were finding in a CCG was that if you simply took that formula and attempted to apply it to a CCG, that some things didn't really work. And CCGs were saying that they would really value some help in thinking through some of this. And that's where I came into the conversation. And what we found, in addition, the second issue that people were saying was that they knew that for their governance to work really well in CCGs, they had to engage with both their members and with the public, their public. And that they recognised that when you say the term governance and use the language of governance, that for many GPs in particular, there were connotations of bureaucracy and red tape, and that was leading to GPs being less inclined to engage in the conversations that CCGs wanted to have. And so there was something about what is the language that we might use that will engage those people we particularly want to engage. So we set up a small task and finish group, populated with CCG folk from around the country, chaired by Steve Lloyd from Hardwick CCG, to explore what help would be useful for CCGs in this context. And that group came up with the idea of commissioning a piece of work around language and around the outcomes of good governance, based on the fact that if we could define what it was we were trying to achieve with our governance, then we could build structures and systems and processes to deliver that, rather than starting with the structures and systems and processes. So we put together a spec and put it out to competitive tender, and we're very pleased to engage the GGI with their partners, Capsticks, to come and work with us to deliver this piece of work. And here we are.
Here we are indeed. And as I said, we've been careering around the country on a series of workshops discussing many of these issues. And today we're in London. Today we're actually in the cybersphere. Tomorrow we're in Manchester. So we've had a number of questions sent in from Twitter and through other means. And I'm going to come to Gerard first to start the discussion. And Simon Whitehouse, who's the Chief Officer at NHS South Cheshire CCG and NHS Vale Royal CCG, asks, and the words he uses are interesting, how do we ensure that the board agenda makes a positive difference to outcomes for patients and has a real impact on care? Gerard.
Thanks, Andrew. I think the first thing to work out is which organisation are we talking about here? Are we talking about NHS England, as colloquially called the board? Are we talking about the CCG governing body and what it's doing? And I think one of the interesting questions around this whole sphere is that outcomes is a major part of what the mandate is about. And the mandate is principally on NHS England, but it's also very clearly on CCGs as well, who must be compliant with the objective and requirements of the mandate too. So I think whether it's NHS England or whether it is the CCG governing body, they both have to be very clear as to when they are commissioning, how are they actually getting the information back over the outcomes for patients that they are making a difference to with the commissioning they're undertaking. Now, we're spending a lot of time at the minute on integration and how that's going to work, but I think one of the things across that is how are we going to get the data together to actually show us that realistically the new commissioning structure is making a difference to the outcomes for patients, which is really what they're interested in. And I don't think there's any easy solution to that, because getting outcome data together has never really been something we've spent a large amount of time on within the NHS. We've commissioned, providers may have some very good outcome data as to what happens within their organisations, but for commissioners, that's a different issue. And I think working with GGI and working with other organisations that look at governance is really important for commissioners to understand how they can get that information together and be clear when they're asked in the annual report, what differences have you actually made? They can be clear over that and they can give the evidence to back up what they say.
Now that of course is the impact or the outcomes of the organisation as a whole being effectively run. If we take Mr Whitehouse's use of the word board to actually mean whoever is in control of a CCD, and we sort of think of this in terms of, okay, to that broader mission of producing great health outcomes for the people of South Cheshire and Vale Royal, what's the difference that the governing body and the governance mechanism actually makes? Alex, what would you want to see there?
I mean, I think the thing for me, and the biggest difference actually of clinical commissioning groups in the new commissioning sector is that notion of clinically led commissioning, but also the membership as well. So thinking about Simon's question, and I know Simon well, so I'm sure that his CCG making a great contribution for their local population. But the membership of that CCG should really be driving how the organisation operates for the best outcomes for patients. And I think for clinically led commissioning and thinking about the number of GPs who are all part of CCGs, because that's ultimately what they're made up of, they have a very different connection with patients than I think we've seen in our previous commissioning organisations. They know their populations. And so I would expect, if I was thinking about a governing body agenda, rather than, it's interesting that Simon talks about board agenda, but if I was thinking about the governing body, I'd really expect to see in that a reflection of what the CCG understand their local population to be and what their CCG understand their local population to need. And I think with this new environment, or a year into the new environment, we're seeing a different type of accountability as well. So I think a lot of the CCGs who I talk to and the GPs on a kind of, when I talk to them as well, feel a real sense of accountability to their patients for making actually what is a huge amount of money now with clinical commissioning groups, 2/3 of the budget for the NHS, of making that do absolutely the best that it can and getting the best value for the patients locally.
I'm going to come to David in a minute, but to sort of ask you a sort of devil's advocate question, that's fine, but why do you need a governing body and governance to enable that to happen? What would the advantage be of having a governing body?
So I think for me, one of the things, if you link this to accountability, is one of the things that the local population and indeed, wider, we want to know is how do organisations make decisions? How are they operating on our behalf? What are they doing on a day-to-day basis to make the outcomes better for patients? And I think that actually having good governance processes in place enables that. It's, for me, governance is about the culture and the way in which the organisation operates to enable people to do the right thing. It's not a kind of a thing in its sense for me. It's not, and I appreciate entirely what Nicola was talking about at the beginning about the kind of the bureaucracy associated with the word governance. But for me, governance has always been the thing that keeps me going in the right direction and enables the organisations to work really effectively together. So I know, again, we've talked, I think, Andrew, in one of your documents, you've talked about that notion of the word safe. And we always talk about governance makes us safe, but actually I think governance helps us in the public sector make the right decisions for our local populations in a transparent way. And I think that's what the governing body can do, because you're bringing lots of different people, lay folk, nurses, the GPs, lots of folk together who will have different perspectives but are making those decisions together in a much more transparent way, I would argue.
I'm going to ask David in a minute about how he feels about the balance of the different people on a governing body, and then come to you, Karen, and talk maybe about, from your point of view as head of governance in a CCG, what you would expect to see in terms of good practice so that the governing body was able to add some value. So David, you're in the mix, you're on the board of one of these new clinical commissioning groups. How does it feel different, and how do you feel that CCGs, with the particular balance they have on their governing bodies, are able to add some value to the health of the NHS mission?
Clinical commissioning groups are essentially, I think, local organisations, aren't they? Vitally important that commissioning decisions, priorities locally, are set locally by people who are predominantly drawn from that local community. And I very much agree with Alex's point that the starting point needs to be a close understanding of what the particular needs of that community which that group is serving are, and they'll vary from one to another. So to have that board, that governing body, making the decisions on behalf of that group for that area, composed primarily of general practitioners who on a day-to-day basis are meeting patients, know closely what their patients' needs are, I think is very important. I think it's important too that there should be, as there are, lay members who are not actually practicing in medicine in that area, sometimes to challenge assumptions, to give constructive challenge, to say, hey, what about this, what about that, that's not what people are telling me. And then to have a practicing medic and nurse, experienced nurse from outside that area, also important, to give a view and a perspective which is expert in terms of their professions, but isn't can be an outside view in terms of bringing some experience from another area. I'm new to the NHS. I've only have not been involved personally until the setting up of our clinical commissioning group, when I was fortunate enough to be appointed as one of the lay members. And I must say I've been impressed by that mix so far. I've been impressed by the enthusiasm of people to do the right thing, the willingness of people to engage in constructive debate, to try to come to a collective decision about what is right for that particular community.
Okay, thank you. So we're sort of developing on the argument from, you know, the idea that CCGs need to have an impact, and then there's a particular role that the kind of boards that we've constructed have to that, and we've heard from David a little bit now about how those boards are constituted. So Karen, you're head of governance at a successful CCG. How would you describe good practice to make the governing body add value? I keep returning to this phrase, add value.
I think the first thing to say is that because CCGs vary so much in terms of population and the challenges that they face, one of the key issues is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think that's what's been very important for me about this project, is the fact that it has been focusing on the outcomes rather than looking at imposing systems and processes on CCGs, because it may be that what works for one is really quite unworkable in another. And in terms of effective governing bodies, clearly we are clinical commissioning groups. We need to be clinically led. We need to have clinical majorities. And there was some guidance in the early days around the size of governing bodies, and if essentially we were told that governing bodies shouldn't be too large, so a lot of CCGs kept the governing bodies quite small. But as we've matured through the year, I think more than one governing body is actually looking at how they're constituted and whether or not the mix is as it should be, and not in terms of the richness, because I really do feel that the richness that we have on the governing bodies is right. It's in terms of the sheer scale of what we're asking those people to do. And when you're looking at GPs who are still practicing, it's a big drain on their time. So it's looking at innovative ideas to bring other GPs into the mix, and how they actually inform the governing body. And equally with lay members, we stayed with the recommendation of 2 lay members, but what we're finding is that their input is very valuable, and in actual fact the call on their time is actually a lot more than we expected it to be initially. So I think there is still work to be done on what the right governing body looks like for each individual CCG.
Andrew, could I just follow that?
Yep.
Just to add, I think you're absolutely right around the notion of one size doesn't fit all, and it's been really interesting about how governing bodies and how CCGs have developed, I guess, over the last 12 months. And indeed, I'm sure over the next 12 months, it'll probably look quite different, you know, because as time goes on, I guess as CCGs, you understand what you need, but you also understand what's missing, don't you?
Yes.
And I think one of the things my reflection is that if we go back a year or 18 months and we think about that kind of notion of clinically led commissioning, there was that real focus on general practice. And then there was kind of a bit of an extension. You talked, David, about kind of nurses, the secondary care doctor. It's quite interesting when you find some CCGs who are also now thinking about how do they engage with other professions. And I did some work earlier this week around pharmacy, and given that one of the things that we all are aspiring to, I think, within health is that much better care out of hospital, and how do we make the most of services in the community, there are probably other professions who will, over time, play a role with CCGs like pharmacists, who perhaps didn't originally. And I think you're right. I don't think it will be that the law will change around what has to be on a governing body, but I would think that CCGs probably will, on an individual basis, think about who's going to add the most value, Andrew, going back to your value word, who's going to add the most for us and for our population, and how can we engage further? So it'd be really interesting to see how other clinical professions make up part of that as time goes on as well.
Let me sort of push that challenge a little bit, because we know that healthcare is going to be moving into some straitened circumstances quite soon. So Hilary Merritt, who is the editor of the Royal Society of Medicine's journal Clinical Risk, asks what are the key challenges for GP members on CCG governing bodies? And if I could sort of tie into that, sure, you can make a compelling case that you need people closely connected with patients and the wants and needs of patients, but and also with other clinicians too. But what about some other professional skills being brought into it? I mean, how about some accountants? How about some people who understand population demography? How about public health? Where would you see the particular challenges, though, for GPs on governing bodies?
I think that's a really good point, because I think that when this all kind of started, I don't think there was ever any intention that GPs would become managers. And I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to really make sure that we have the partnership in place that will support clinicians to lead. But as you say, Andrew, there's the kind of almost like the professionalisation of commissioning to enable all the parties who come round the table to do the best for their population to be able to play their part. I think at the moment we're probably feeling our way through. I recognise your point, Karen, about it's very difficult for some GPs to kind of get the balance right when you're rushing between CCG work and then going back to the practice. So I do think that there are some significant issues for us in terms of our capacity, and we need to build on the different folk who are available. We need to think about how we use commissioning support to enable us to do the right thing for our populations. And I don't think that there's a single answer that will help Hilary around how you resolve the key challenges. I think the fact that we know that they are there, and that there are lots of people now thinking and trying to resolve some of those on a CCG to CCG basis, as well as some of the work that we're doing nationally about how do you sustain clinical leadership. I think that's really important. And I guess, again, it depends on how different CCGs are operating, and what we probably need to do is really learn from those CCGs who are going that bit further and are starting to kind of get those partners working really effectively together, and try and share that a bit more widely than perhaps we are at the moment.
I'm going to ask Gerard the same question as well. What, in your view, are the key challenges, particularly for GP members of CCG governing bodies? Of course, in your role at Capsticks, you advise multiple complicated healthcare organisations of all shapes and sizes about some of the most pressing and difficult decisions. You help organisations navigate their way through competent decision making when threatened with having their decisions overtaken by judicial review or change through judicial review. So you're a good person to ask. What would your take be on the key challenges for particularly the GP members on the governing bodies? And maybe we could then extend that out to some of the other kinds of members as well, and bring David and Karen in.
So I think one of the main challenges GP members are going to have is maintaining clinical focus, which is one of the main reasons they're there. But actually, when you become involved in running an organisation, there are a lot of other things that go on apart from what your main job is, which is to commission services for the public and for your community. And I think one of the other things that the GPs who are actually on the board face, and we haven't seen too much of it yet, but it starts to come along at some point, is perhaps a bit of a feeling of isolation from the membership. So they're a GP membership organisation, and their the GPs who are members, maybe they're saying, we don't agree with that decision, we don't like that decision, and they may put challenge to the actual GPs who are on the board in, trying to maintain that challenge, but have it transparently, have it so it doesn't become the focus of what they're doing and detract from the actual main job, which is ensuring that the CCG itself operates effectively, manages to get the services in that the local community need, is going to be quite a challenge for them, I think, because it's inevitably one of those kind of conflict areas which comes up. And, we spent God knows how many hours talking to GPs about conflicts when we started this whole process. And a lot of that, to be honest, focused more on you're a provider and now you're going to be a commissioner, how are you going to overcome that? I don't think we've had that many problems from that.
No.
But I think going forward, there will start to be tensions now between GPs who are members and those who are on the actual governing body. And I think the other thing that we're starting to see a lot more now from CCGs is an understanding that the Constitution is a lot more flexible and the law around it is a lot more flexible than people thought. And what do you want to do through your Constitution? So the Constitution is rigid to the degree that you've got to try and put everything in it in order to make sure you can operate effectively. But actually, when you look at it, there's a lot of flexibility then. So when you spoke about, do you want to have accountants on? Do you want to, heaven forbid, ever have a lawyer on? do you want to bring on people with other professionals, especially those in public health? Then actually, you can do that. But you have to specify them within your Constitution. And you also, and something else that I think we kind of missed a little bit at the start, was that there is a difference between the way CCG specifies how it's going to deal with its functions and who may help them with it, and the way the governing body does. They are different within the Act. And actually looking at that, and the governing body saying, you know what, we want to be really clear that the people we want to be able to help us are, say, our accountants, or say people from the local authority who can help us with public health. We want them to be part of this whole process. It's fantastic. And I think they're now starting to understand those flexibilities. We're doing quite a lot over dealing with that. So for me, the main issue that the GPs are going to have is going to be maintaining clinical focus and then getting some pushback and a bit of challenge from the GP membership over decisions they make.
So how about, David, some of the other non-GP members of CCG governing bodies? How have you found being able to, as new to the NHS, as you said, very experienced in running complicated, large public sector organisations, how do you find the contribution that other professions can make to the governing body?
I have found that making a contribution which is from a slightly different perspective, there's plenty of room for that. That's been respected, and I'm pleased to say it's always listened to. It's not necessarily always agreed with, and I wouldn't expect it to be. I think I have to say it normally is. On your starting question, Andrew, about what are the key challenges for GP members, it's widely understood, isn't it, that the health needs of our local areas and the costs of meeting those are increasing at a far faster rate than the resources available to us to meet them. And so difficult decisions are having to be made and will increasingly have to be made about what are the priorities, what is it that we are going to spend the available money on in our particular area. And spending money on one thing will inevitably mean, and especially if we're going to spend more money on one thing because we've identified that as a local priority, will inevitably mean that less money is spent on something else. So all of us are going to have to be prepared, all of us involved in decision making for CCGs are going to have to be prepared to make difficult decisions. There's a tendency, isn't there, on all of us to want to please everybody for as much of the time as possible. And GPs in particular are seeing all their patients or the patients who come to see them regularly, seeing many of them throughout the day. A particular challenge for GP members, I think, is to take these difficult decisions and to be prepared to stand by them. To say,
because that's the governance task, isn't it? It's to elevate yourself above and to take responsibility beyond your own immediate needs and wants and desires.
And the decisions will not always be popular with everybody. Any decision, I think, is likely to be popular with somebody and unpopular with somebody else. And we've got to be prepared to take those decisions and stand by them and justify them.
So, Karen, you're advising your governing body about governance, and you're running the governance system within the clinical commissioning group. Do you see, as things get more sticky over the next couple of years, any particular ways in which you're going to have to reinforce good governance? Thinking really in the first year for CCGs, it's not been a year characterised by having to make terribly difficult decisions. And particularly this point that your colleagues were bringing out, that as we move into sticky times, the membership who elect the majority of the governing body onto the governing body may find the brave decisions taken by the governing body unpalatable. So how do you see some of those challenges coming up? And what good governance can do to help navigate their way through this?
I think it comes back to the transparency of the decisions, and although I advocate governance light, because we know that the GPs don't like governance for governance sake. They like if they can see a rationale behind governance. For example, Jared touched on interests, conflicts, and conflicts of interest is a huge topic within CCGs. So it's around having very clear procedures set out over which everybody has ownership and understands what the process within the CCG is. I mean, in terms of the challenges that the GPs face, I think the challenges are outweighed by the fact that the GPs on the governing body can actually and are already seeing the difference that they're making. You know, the comments are coming back to me all the time about how different the commissioning process feels in the new landscape, and with GPs being involved in the decisions, and GPs actually getting involved in the contracting round, which we've just all been through, and how that's progressed. I won't say smoothly, but it's been a very different process from what I understand this year, and the benefits of having the GPs involved at that early stage are already being reaped, and also the new way of working is enabling new innovative ideas to be coming up from the grassroots level, because those discussions are being had around the governing body table about what is important to our patients.
I'm here to sort of get debate going, and maybe be a bit controversial, but I mean, a lot of what you've said convinces me that GP involvement in the management of commissioning is really important.
But I think the terminology, management is perhaps the wrong word. It's leadership of commissioning as opposed to management of commissioning. Right.
But what I was going to say is, what you haven't convinced me is that the involvement in the governance of this is adding any value. Now, talk me round.
Can I just make one point over that? So we've already had a bit of a taste of what can happen if you don't carry your GP commissioners with you, and the person who suffered most was the Secretary of State in South London. Okay, and I don't have to make a statement over because that was a decision of the courts, fortunately. But the government decided to subject themselves to the 4 key tests, and then they failed to deliver on one of the key ones, which is making sure you have the support of your commissioners, your GP commissioners. And I think one of the things that has flowed from that we are slightly concerned about is that you have CCG governing bodies who are representative, who are elected, who have GP members on it, who may make a decision which actually their membership doesn't like. And if you haven't been able, through your processes, through your governance, to actually make clear why you've had to make that decision, why it's important for the interests of the community, why the GP members should support it, The nightmare scenario you could face is that your own membership could turn and say, we don't agree with that. The question which then comes back is, have you actually got support from GP commissioners or not? Or does the whole decision unravel because it's just the CCG governing body and it's not the CCG itself?
The way that we get around that in our CCG, not get around, that's entirely the wrong phrase, I don't mean that at all. We, underneath the governing body, we have a commissioning delivery group which is made up of each and every member practice of the clinical commissioning group. Now, we're a small clinical commissioning group, so we're able to do that. But the key commissioning decisions in the CCG are discussed in that forum so that all member practices have an opportunity to comment. Therefore, by the time it goes to the governing body, the governing body are essentially ratifying a decision which has come from the membership. And before we go on conflicts of interest, we also have another process in place whereby we have another committee, our Corporate Performance Committee, who, amongst different tasks, one of their tasks is to consider any commissioning decisions which affect primary care commissioning, because obviously the GPs have a conflict of interest on primary care commissioning. So in that way, we do try to ensure that that we do take the membership with us.
Now there are people out there tweeting at us, and now you lot have to shape up, because Candy Morris says, I'm not seeing how this live conversation is addressing the language and outcomes of governance, so please do address yourself to the exam question. Thank you, Candy. Umesh Pradhu is a medical director at Wigan and Lee NHS Trust, a foundation trust. It's actually Wrightington, Wigan and Lee. Puts a profound point forward, actually. Does the panel think there are good leaders in CCGs to take the agenda forward? Answers on the back of the postcard.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
So one of the great things about my job is that I get to work with lots and lots of CCGs, and I'm out and about kind of, understanding how CCGs are operating. And I think there are some really great leaders out there. So earlier this week, we had all the chief clinical officers together for a kind of 36-hour development day, and the passion that they have and the commitment and drive is really amazing. And so I think that there absolutely are some great leaders out there with some real passion and some real commitment to their local populations as well. I would say that probably one of the things that we haven't been brilliant at yet, but we could do more, is kind of articulating how clinical commissioning groups have really done brilliantly well in this first year. And I know NHS clinical commissioners published some case studies not that long ago, kind of articulating some of the work. But I think there are some great individuals, and I think there's some great organisations. And I think one of the things that we collectively as an NHS that we need to do is really support those leaders so that they can sustain themselves, but then also build further. And we need to think about the next generation of leaders as well. So I think there absolutely are.
I'd like to also just bring in a comment from Jane Phoenix from Sussex, who is an independent consultant now, but formerly ran community health services down in Sussex, amongst many other things that she's done. She writes on Twitter that governance should bring transparency as to how decisions are made, etc. We also first need to make it clear what the decision is. We, David, earlier were having a little bit of a discussion about this tension that although these are clinically led organisations and they are membership organisations, CCGs are also public bodies. And I was wondering that maybe there's some kind of credo one could build up that one of the outcomes of a well-governed CCG would be managing that balance of multiple stakeholder interests within a public body, that is also at the same time a membership group. I don't know if you have any comments on
Yes,
that.
the CCG, as we've said, is a membership group composed of the practicing GPs in its area, but vitally important for us to remember, isn't it? And this is part of the role, I think, of the lay members, to make sure that nobody forgets this, that the decisions are not being made on behalf of GPs, they're being made on behalf of that local population for whom the health services are provided. CCGs are making decisions about very substantial sums of public money. They are sort of quasi-trustees, aren't they, for that money which is not theirs. It's money which is owned by the local population and providing services for the local population. And so a vitally important aspect, as that question rightly makes clear, of good governance is transparency. Decisions are being made on behalf of local people. It's vitally important that they should be made openly, clearly, so that people can see how those decisions are being made, and so that people have trust and faith in the way in which those decisions are made. If people don't agree with a decision, they will still find it possible to respect it, if they will respect the openness and good faith with which that decision is made. And so vitally important, I think, that we all remain aware of and try to fulfil the Nolan principles of public administration. They should be at the centre of everything that we do.
Would you like, just very quickly, you don't have to list them, but say the purpose of the Nolan principles and why they came about?
Right, well, they came about, didn't they, through the Committee on Standards in Public Life, when Lord Justice Nolan, its first chair, I think, was chairing it. The committee was set up, as I recall, under Mr. Major's government, when there was a growing public concern about what popularly became known as sleaze in certain public functions. The committee was set up to advise the government on how can we restore and maintain public trust, public confidence in public services, in decision-making in public services, in the way in which people conduct themselves and behave when they are exercising public functions. The committee gave us these principles, and I think they're a pretty good yardstick for us all to try to live up to.
Well, let's stick with the importance of transparency and reputation, and also decisions, because of course CCGs aren't the only types of public sector commissioner, and we were talking about South London earlier, Gerard. You know, we live in a complex world in health and social care economies, and so how would you feel, Karen? How would you like to see effective governance make sense of a world where you have multiple commissioners? Or while she's thinking, would anybody else like to come in on that?
I was just going to answer Candy's question, actually.
Go for it.
I think there is an answer to it. She might not agree with it. I think CCGs, when they were first thought of and when they were first created, inherited a governance language, and I think they inherited it from the PCTs and from the SHAs. And it didn't necessarily fit with what they had to do, but they adapted it, and they managed to enable it to let them all hit authorisation. It's no mean feat for 211 organisations in this country to manage to get through, well, I think we're 119 criteria.
Yeah.
Yes. So we were involved in supporting that as well, but to be able to get to that, and the outcome being they all got authorised, some of them with conditions, some of them with directions, but at the end of the day, they all managed to get through it. I think the challenge that comes now, which is part of this work, which is going very well, is that actually the CCGs now need to change that inherited language into the language they need to take forward what they need to do in terms of commissioning services for the public and moving into a different kind of phase. Integration is wholly different, really, to what we've looked at before, if it operates properly. So I think that's kind of the starting point to Candy's question, but I think there's still a lot to do on it.
We're going to have about 5 more minutes of discussion before we come to Jane Brown, who's a senior associate at GGI, who's going to first give us some thoughts, having listened to the debate, and then we're going to come back to Nicola King, who's going to do the same. So, if
Can I answer the multiple?
You can answer your multiple one.
Yes, please, because it is absolutely key, and is a very. You have to understand that we're operating in a very complex environment with lead commissioner roles, associate commissioner roles, joint commissioning across local authorities, voluntary sector, acutes, community. The list is endless. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of, and there is a huge danger with multiple organisations with multiple understandings of what governance is and structures and processes to support that things will drop into holes between each organisation. So I don't have the answer, but it is very high on my list to try. And I think it's probably around understanding the governance of each of the organisations that you're working with.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And I think that the public won't forgive the public sector if we get it wrong. Patients or carers are dropped between,
I agree.
Essentially organisational arrangements between different public sector bodies.
But I do think, though, if you subscribe to the notion that a community has a public sector pound that we want to spend to get the best outcomes for the population, and you want to be kind of greater than the sum of your parts as those public sectors, the kind of complexity makes the governance arrangements of each of those individual organisations and whatever partnerships are in place to enable you to do that ever more important. So you think about the kind of, I know in some of the discussion documents, we've talked about what are the basic questions that you would need to be able to articulate and answer for your population, who's in charge, how do you make decisions. It's really important that we have that and understand that as the NHS and CCGs and NHS England, but also we're able to understand that across the partners, as you say, Karen, and the number of different folk.
I think it's really important in this that the focus stays on the patient.
Yes.
What shouldn't be happening is that governance, structures, processes actually stop a patient having the treatment that they need wherever they need it at the time that they need it. And I think that's really, really key, and that's something that GPs are absolutely passionate about, is about making sure that their patients get the right care at the right time.
Yes, and get the right care at the right time next year.
Yes.
And get the right care at the right time, regardless of what's wrong with them, or how old they are, or what social class they come from, or how much wealth they have, which is really the governance mission, isn't it?
Yes.
It's to ensure fairness and organisational effectiveness and being able to deliver. I'm going to very shortly be coming to you, Jane, just in sort of 30 seconds each. If you had a magic wand to try and make the efforts of governing bodies more effective, and the magic wand worked, starting at your end, David, what would the one thing would you like to see?
Keep thinking about your local population. Keep thinking that you are just one part of the totality of public expenditure in that area. How can we make sense of the whole?
No. Alex.
And I would build on that, because I think for me, we're kind of getting there, and this debate's great around what's the language of governance for CCGs, but the issue of multiple commissioners population and joint commissioning is the one thing for me. So if we could get to a stage where the governing body are as confident with their own organisation's governance and the partnerships they have, the governance of that would be the thing for me, I think.
I think in terms of the wish list, we've actually probably got it coming in. One of the biggest problems we had right at the start was the fact that really CCGs couldn't operate effectively together because they couldn't form a joint committee, and they couldn't actually come together, and they couldn't draw together their governance arrangements, align them. And that hopefully should all come in October this year, And that's really going to enable them to push on with the integration agenda and with a whole load of other work they want to do, because they can truly work together effectively. They're resource-light organisations, they can draw those together, and they can really start to make a difference to the outcomes for patients, I think, that way.
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
You don't have anything to add?
No.
Well, look, thank you all. It's an hour that has flown past, and it's nice to know that some people are with us on this mission. So, Jane.
Okay, well, what I've been doing is, as you've been talking, is sort of drawing out some of the key themes and starting to look at some of the most interesting things, particularly in terms of the resonance with the other workshops that we've been doing. Very taken by the idea of the two key challenges to GPs on commissioning boards being around the balance of interests, having the interests of their membership at heart, but at the same time being in danger of having some isolation from that membership. And also this issue about challenge to maintaining clinical focus. And I guess for me, hearing what you're saying and then thinking about what some of the workshops have been talking about, the added value of governance in that context is about creating the conditions in which the GPs and the other commissioners on the governing bodies are actually able to explain their decisions and the context in which those decisions were taken. So I think it's vital. We haven't necessarily touched a huge amount on the membership issue in the debate today, and I was very interested in what Gerard was saying about how you can't please all of the people all of the time. And I guess one of the other challenges, therefore, is going to be to not necessarily try to be a friend of all the world, but to sort of actually create a situation where, but also avoid, if you like, the situation where your decision-making becomes so diluted because actually you're trying to take on too much of a consensus, if it can have too much of a consensus. So that was a really interesting couple of points. The other thing I think that's really, really interesting here is about the joint commissioning between organisations and what the governance needs to look like when you've got more than one commissioner operating in very, very different environments. So if you have I'm thinking about the commissioning arrangements and the governance arrangements which may need to be put in place around the Better Care Fund, and the kind of templates and case studies we might start to develop around some of those things, I think are going to be really, really interesting, especially where you've got clinical commissioners who are in the driving seat here, but at the same time they're going to have to work with local authority colleagues who've got their own set of stakeholders, their own membership, and trying to drive some of that through, I think, is going to be absolutely fascinating. And then just one other point, really, was about the culture of governance, which I think it was Alex who said something about that, which is that it's not about the systems and processes. Everybody has to have system and process. We know that. There are some things that just have to be there, and whether we like it or not, thou shalt have an audit committee and all the things that go with that. Having said that, actually, if you took all that away, if you stripped all of it back, if you don't have that organisational culture that embraces good governance, then actually you are lost and you can never actually explain your decisions. So really, really interesting points coming through and very much part of, very, very much in resonance with what's been said in other places as well. Nicola, I don't know if you want to comment as well.
I think all of those things and one more, if I can make a pitch. And I think one of the things that struck me from the panel was the frequency with which people talked about local people. And how the CCG and the decisions it makes are important to local people, and the role that local people have, the interest that local people have as stakeholders in that. And it was really interesting to that came through in every question that you discussed, and I was really pleased to hear that, because I really believe that that's what it's about. It's about the people that we serve.
It is. I mean, you don't want to get too sort of Royston Vasey about it, if everybody can remember that. No. But actually, it is absolutely about that, isn't it? It is very much about the local people. Can I just say a little bit about what's been coming out through the other workshops as well? Because it would help. I mean, and it helps to just address the question from Candy, or should I say the reflection from Candy. We've got real broad agreement from the other workshops about getting the language of governance right, that there's something in the exam question, it's a valid question. less agreement about what those words and phrases actually ought to be. And some cause more controversy than others. So some words are universally loathed, it would seem, e.g. control.
Oh, I disagree. We had some auditors that really like control.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Okay.
Surprise us.
I thought they like compliance better than control.
No, they like control.
Oh, they like
Systems
control.
Yeah.
Okay, control. Okay, I stand corrected on that one. Other words are not particularly liked, but the sense of them is liked. So we've been using the word fairness,
Yeah.
and we've had a huge amount of discussion about fair to who, fair about what. Is fair something that you can actually measure? Much more favourable, though, words like equitable, equal opportunity, and this equal opportunity about the ability to take part in the decision, even if the decision is not one that you would necessarily would have hoped the outcome would be. So that's quite interesting. Transparency comes out all the time, and understanding of how the decisions are taken, and this real desire to change negative connotations of governance and its connotation perhaps with red tape and bureaucracy, but a less of an ability to actually define what the alternatives are, what those outcomes could be. One really good example was about changing the environment from one where you manage risk and control risk to actually, if your governance is good and you have that culture, you actually create a greater appetite for risk. So I think that those kind of points have been coming out consistently, haven't they, over all the workshops?
Some really interesting discussions in that space, actually. Really nice comment that came through in one of the workshops about the degree to which if you see governance as your means to enable innovation and take risks, and CCGs do need to do that. A lovely discussion which started with that as the principle and kind of went through a process of asking the question, a really thoughtful question about, so does that mean that your governance should lag behind if you're innovating and your kind of governance is catching up with what you're doing all the time?
Absolutely.
And the conversation was really interesting. So one person asked the question in a really thoughtful way, and the rest of the group started to debate that fact. And the conclusion that they came to was, if you think of governance as being your systems and processes, then possibly it should lag behind. But actually, if we embrace this notion of governance being about the culture of the organisation and setting the tone for how decisions are taken, rather than the systems that you put in place, then no, that absolutely needs to be at the forefront. And I thought that was a lovely way of explaining it.
Yeah, it does, and that speaks again to that cultural dimension, doesn't
Yeah.
it? It's really, really important. I mean, one just to say as well, though, having said all of that, in terms of the survey results that we've been getting back, it's encouraging that about 72% of people who've responded so far think that their organisation does governance well.
Oh,
so that's a good
Yeah.
thing. Having said that, in the qualifying remarks, there's something about inclusivity is a phrase that's used a lot, and relying on action and evidence base. And one of the things that's come out through the workshop is that, and I'm not wishing to overgeneralise, but essentially clinicians generally have a scientific sort of turn of mind, don't they? And if we have evidence on action, evidence base and action, it tends to be much more engaging than if we have too much just continuous process. And a nice phrase from one of our GP colleagues who's attended the meetings, that good governance should support the vision of an organisation and ensure it is appropriately accountable and transparent in its workings. And I thought that was quite a nice little quote as well, just to end on.
Do you have any final words, Nicola, before I sort of wrap up?
There's a couple, I think, that Jane didn't include in her summing up about the language. And I think one of the words that I've heard frequently over the past week in our tour of the country is confidence. And that sense of people, local peoples, a local population, or the members or other stakeholders having confidence in the decisions that have been taken. And I think that really sums up what this is all about.
Yeah.
Okay, and although we're just about to go offline, and so this little debate's finished, the debate hasn't closed for all of you. You can find more information about this very interesting project, which is about halfway through, on www.ccggovernance.org. That website will route you through to a survey, which is really important. We don't just want people involved in CCGs to take part in the survey. It's everybody's chance to help influence how we get this right and how we properly explain the governance mission and the benefits that will come from doing governance well. So please take some time. You won't get sent, you won't receive loads of calls from people sending you double glazing afterwards. It's an anonymous survey that doesn't collect person identifiable data, and so that would really be good if you could do that. You can also get a download of this document, which really explains the project in more detail, and will be reissued in time as we collect together the first sets of results. And also from that website, www.ccggovernance.org, you'll be able to go through to the LinkedIn discussion. A few more than 600 people have been involved in that. There's some extremely thoughtful little essays on different elements of this subject that we've been talking about, and the participants range from GPs not involved in their CCGs particularly, to ones that are intimately are, to people who've worked in healthcare governance for longer than is decent to describe, to people who work at Hewlett-Packard, to one gentleman who runs a company that sends actors in to mimic crises to test people's ability to respond to them. So a very Catholic selection of input there, and they're really good. So thanks for your patience. I hope our first sort of broadcast has worked quite well. And above all, thank you very much to NHS England for allowing us a chance to be involved in this great project. So good night.